Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and I want to welcome you again to another event, this culminating event, excuse me, in Richmond. You may know, of course, that this was originally scheduled for back in September when we went into our own crisis, Hurricane Isabel, and we've had to switch it to tonight. Actually, that turned out to be very fortuitous for us. As you may know, this past weekend was the 25th anniversary, if that's the right word, of 3 Mile Island, as it turns out. We also, in the interim between last fall and now, learned that Jim Blight, who is a consultant for the Fog of War documentary, which won an Oscar last month, so we were able to say that. And we were able to have Eugene Hickok join us, who's this year's leader in residence. So actually, Hurricane Isabel might have done us, if it didn't do Richmond a big favor, it might have done the forum a little bit of a favor. We are sorry that Mary Sue Terry can't be with us tonight, so we apologize for that, but we still have a very, very full panel for all of you. I want to introduce our moderator for this evening. He is one of those people, of course, who needs no introduction. He's one of the most respected journalists in the country, Roger Mudd. His career took him from CBS to NBC to PBS at the NewsHour, and of course to the History Channel. It all started, of course, here in Richmond, where he wrote for the Richmond News Leader, and then, of course, embarked upon that really, truly illustrious career. He received his undergraduate degree from Washington and Lee University, an alma mater we share, got his master's in American History and Literature from the University of North Carolina, and soon will be receiving the University of Richmond honorary degree at commencement this year. Most importantly, though, he's a member of our Jepson National Advisory Council. So we welcome him to Richmond, the Jepson community, and please join me in welcoming him, and I'll turn it over to Roger.
I think only the University of Richmond could have held this panel together and had it wait so long since September to be here. It's always a pleasure to be invited back to Richmond. Boatwright this and Maudlin this and Pitfield that, and now it's Jepson. So it's a great pleasure for all of us to be here. It's such a lovely school, and it gives us such a good feeling when we come. Is it true? Is it true that Americans are regularly and systematically disappointed in the leadership of their elected officials, of their corporate owners, of their religious ministers, of their athletic heroes? And if they are, is their disappointment any greater than it is, say, in Great Britain or Italy or Japan or Russia? And what it does account for failures in leadership? Is it a lack of courage, an unwillingness to make enemies, fear of defeat, lack of information, too much bad information, a failure of character? Is it greed? Richard Grasso, the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange, handpicks his compensation committee, which votes him a lump sum of $140 million. Is that regulatory leadership or what? And what accounts for success in leadership? I think my favorite story occurred more than 50 years ago when Harry Truman, at one of the low points in his presidency, was faced with a simultaneous walkout of the nation's coal miners and a national rail strike that together threatened to bring America to a standstill. Truman summoned to the White House the leaders of the two unions, both longtime allies of the Democratic Party, but when they rejected Truman's generous arbitration terms, he told them, if you think I'm going to sit here and let you tie up this whole country, you're crazy as hell. You've got 48 hours to reach a settlement, and if you don't, I'm going to take over the railroads. The deadline passed without compliance. Truman, true to his word, got the Congress to give him authority to draft the rail workers into the Army. The unions caved, Truman's popularity soared, and his political power increased. What Truman showed in May of 1946 was what Haynes Johnson called an instinctive understanding that the public always backs presidents when they take a strong stand on clear issues in the public's interest. Are fine leaders born that way, or do they surprise even themselves during a great crisis? Are great leaders really surfing public opinion, or are they ahead of the breakers? Do great leaders tell us what we want to hear or what we ought to hear? How candid with us should they be? Why cannot they admit mistakes? Will admitting a mistake really undermine their leadership? Is the public prepared to handle the unvarnished truth? Fritz Mondale ought to know. Who can forget his acceptance speech in 1984? Let's tell the truth, he said. Mr. Reagan will raise taxes and so will I. He won't tell you. I just did. And how do we know and how can we tell whether candidates for public office really carry with them the qualities of leadership? Could any of us predicted, based on what we knew about him at the time, that Richard Nixon would try to subvert the Constitution? Well, we all have our own lists of recent crises and our opinions about how leaders have stood up to them. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, Watergate, Iran-Contra, the Gulf War, health care, 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq War, pedophilia in the Catholic Church, the electrical blackout last year. So it goes without saying, and I'll say it anyway, that hovering over all of these questions because of the coming campaign are the leadership qualities of President Bush and his opponent, John Kerry. So we have our work cut out for us this evening, and our distinguished panel is geared to go, so to speak, maybe even wired. In alphabetical order, may I introduce first Dr. James G. Blight, Professor of International Relations at Brown. His interests lie in international security, nuclear weapons policy, U.S. foreign policies. His specialties are the Vietnam War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Before Brown University, he was at the Kennedy School at Harvard and at Grand Valley College in Allendale, Michigan. His undergraduate degree is what was then called Flint College at the University of Michigan. He was a day student back then, working at the local Buick plant, and figuratively, he wore his union suit to class. His graduate degrees are from the University of New Hampshire in psychology, behavioral science, and from the Kennedy School in Security and International Affairs. Dr. Eugene Hickok, the Undersecretary of Education in the Bush cabinet and the principal advisor to Secretary Rod Page, although Gene was nowhere near when the Secretary referred to the NEA as a terrorist organization. Were you? He's a veteran of the first Bush administration in the legal counsel's office at the Justice Department. And during the 90s, Gene was Pennsylvania's Secretary of Education, overseeing the state's education system, where he raised the standards for students and teachers and laid the groundwork for the women's powerhouse basketball team at Penn State. His academic specialty is public policy, the Constitution, and federalism, and when he teams up with his old friend, Professor Gary McDowell of the Jepson School, our Constitution never knew what hit it. And Richard Thornburgh is the former Republican two-term governor of Pennsylvania. He'd been governor for only 60 days when, in 1979, 3 Mile Island broke just 25 years ago. He was the Attorney General in both the Reagan and Bush administrations, Director of the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School in 87, 88, Undersecretary at the United Nations, and was examiner in the WorldCom bankruptcy proceedings. Mr. Thornburgh graduated from Yale and the University of Pittsburgh Law School. His autobiography, Where the Evidence Leads, is in your favorite bookshop as we speak. And may I add this personal note. In 1976, 2 of our sons were among 5 young men apprehended and booked by the campus police at the Sidwell Friends School in Washington while rearranging classroom chairs after dark during a senior class prank. They were released on their own recognizance and remanded to the custody of their freaked out fathers. So here's our format. Our panelists will each speak for 5 or so minutes, and then I might ask a question or two. The panelists will be free to comment on each other's comments. I might ask another question or two, and then after about 35 or 40 minutes, we're going to open it up. We're going to expose the panel to your questions, and we'll have microphones down front so you can be heard by everyone. So we will finish no later than 9 o'clock, just in time for everybody to get back and see Everybody Loves Raymond. So, Professor Blight, will you begin?
Thank you. Our chairman has laid down the law. If we speak more than 5 minutes, the microphone will go out. I've spent about the last 20 years studying the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. And the question arises for anyone who's invested in this kind of effort, as follows: how did virtually the same group of leaders around Kennedy and around Johnson resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most dangerous crisis probably the world has ever seen, but certainly the most dangerous 13 days in the history of the Cold War? How did they get out of that when the same group of people, with one significant exception, the name of the president, led this country in 1964, 65, 66, 67, and 68 into what is, until this moment, the worst foreign policy disaster in the history of the Republic, the escalation of the Vietnam War? Was it that the crises were so much different? Was it that the presidents were so much different? If the crises were different, how were they different? And if the presidents made a difference, what kind of a difference did they make? Now, take the first question on the nature of the crises. I think one of the things that we've discovered as we've held meetings all over the world, but in Havana and Hanoi and Moscow and even in the United States, when we can spring the communist remnants to come to the capitalist forum here, what we've discovered is that the Cuban Missile Crisis, for all three countries concerned, both Cuba, the USSR, and the US, was so riveting and so dangerous and was perceived as such that managing it and escaping it was all the government did until they got out of it. That's very unusual for people at the top level. The Vietnam War has become what we call a crisis in slow motion. At any one moment, no one would have said during the escalation of the war that they were in a crisis. The U.S. mainland wasn't threatened by the NLF or by the North Vietnamese, and yet looking back on it, you have almost a sense of a Greek tragedy unfolding. Why can't these people see what they're getting themselves into? And it appears that this kind of a crisis is much more difficult to identify, it's more difficult to get your resources together, it's more difficult to retain your focus than it is a life-threatening or nation-threatening crisis, as in the missile crisis. Now, second of the two questions, what about the presidents? And here, there's plenty of room for debate, but in the last 2 to 3 years, a lot of audio tapes and some previously unreleased documents have come out. And many of these, or some of these, have found their way into the movie that Ken mentioned, The Fog of War, the Errol Morris film, which won the Oscar last month, in which my colleague Janet Lang and I have served as kind of the, we're called by the film people the resident geeks. We try to keep them honest. We try to make sure that that what is presented as fact is actually fact. What I'd like to do in closing is to just give you a sense of these presidents. Now, I mean, this is very impressionistic, but I am going to quote from the script of the film. And I want to give you something to resonate to. Now, I'm not trying to build a case for or against anybody here, but just it's clear that it was a lot different if you were advising Kennedy than it was Johnson. And I'll let you think about, and we'll be happy to discuss later on exactly what that involved. Now, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was convinced that the missiles were not going to come out without an attack on Cuba. He was convinced of this because why did they put him in? They put him in to threaten the United States, and they're not coming out by negotiation. The following conversation occurred on the 27th of October, 1962. Kennedy, we're not going to get these missiles out of Cuba, probably anyway, by negotiation. Soviet advisor Llewellyn Thompson does something that almost nobody ever does in the presence of the president. He tells him he's wrong, dead wrong. I don't agree, Mr. President. There's still a chance. You mean he'll back down? The important thing for Khrushchev, it seems to me, is to say, I saved Cuba. I stopped an invasion, implying that what we should do is just promise not to invade Cuba, and he'll pull them out, something that Kennedy found a little difficult to imagine. And then Kennedy says, all right. If the attack had occurred, we now know, within 12 to 24 hours, there were 162 nuclear weapons waiting for the Marines to hit the beach in Cuba, and they would have all been incinerated. And we would have had to respond with nuclear weapons. Kennedy asked, and when he asked a question, he expected to get the answer that his advisors believed, not necessarily what he wanted to hear. Here's Kennedy on October 2nd, 1963. McNamara has proposed that we take all of our troops out of Vietnam by the end of '65, and that we pull 1,000 out at the end of '63. Kennedy, the advantage to taking them out is? McNamara, we can say to the Congress and people that we have a plan for reducing the exposure of U.S. combat personnel. Kennedy, my only reservation is, if the war doesn't continue to go well, it will look like we've been overly optimistic. McNamara, we need a way to get out of Vietnam, and this is a way of doing it. Kennedy said, okay, let's do it. He died 7 weeks later. Lyndon Johnson takes office, unexpectedly, of course, on November 22nd, 1963. 3 months later, the following conversation occurs, a phone tape now available from the Johnson Library between Johnson and McNamara. Johnson, hello, Bob? McNamara, yes, Mr. President. Johnson, I hate to modify your speech any because it's been a good one. I'm not going to try to impersonate Johnson. But I just wonder, it's hard not to, if we should find 2 minutes in there for Vietnam. McNamara, yeah, the problem is what to say about it. Well, Johnson, I'll tell you what I would say about it. I'd say we have a commitment to Vietnamese freedom. We could pull out of there and the dominoes would fall and that part of the world would go to the communists and other things of that nature. McNamara, all right, sir, I'll, Johnson, Bob, I always thought it was foolish for you to make any statements about withdrawing. I thought it was bad psychologically, but you and the President thought otherwise, and I just sat there silent. McNamara, you see, Mr. President, the problem is, Johnson, problem, then come the questions. How the hell does McNamara think when he's losing a war he can pull men out of there? It's a good question. John Kennedy had answered it, I think, to his own satisfaction, and the answer was because we can't win. 3 days after Johnson took office, he declared that the policy of this administration would be to win the war. And the same McNamara that was working to pull men out now worked to put men in. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Eugene Hickok.
Thank you, Roger. It's good to be home. I was raised in Richmond, and thanks, Dean, for the opportunity to be back. I must say that we've kept notes about your 2 sons at the Department of Education. We'll talk later. More as a student of politics and leadership than anything else, just a couple of observations that I think are kind of borne out by what you just talked about, frankly. It seems to me that during times of crisis, and of course that's a subjective term, in leadership, it's probably as much how one acts as much as the actions taken. And that doesn't mean that style should trump substance, but at least in public positions, it seems to me that how an individual conducts himself or herself says a lot about the degree to which they have the trust of others. It's a matter of tone, it's a matter of style, the ability to empathize with those undergoing the stress and the challenge, to be able to demonstrate a sense of confidence, even though for most people, I think, when they confront crises, you're anything but confident. So to me, a big part of it is that combination of style and substance. Second, I think, and this is something that I saw, frankly, if I might say so, in Governor Thornburgh 25 years ago, is balance in action and decision making. There's this tendency, I think, to do something, to make a statement, to get something done. The urgency is there. And I think you always have to balance that with a sense of making sure you're doing the right thing. You want to have the expertise around you, but you also want to have your closest, most trusted advisors around you. And how you balance that matters a great deal. I think it, again, reflects what you just said with regard to the two administrations over Kennedy and Johnson. The chemistry that you depend upon with those you know and trust the most, the instincts that you're used to and they're used to, and how do you balance that with the expertise that's needed to meet the particular crisis you confront? Balancing the immediate with the intermediate, with the ability to look at the long term. Crises do not end overnight in most cases. And even if they do, there are lessons everyone learns from them and how you conduct yourself during them. And so that need to balance the intermediate, the immediate, the long term. And that sense of, I've got to respond with a sense of urgency, but how I respond will determine sustainability. You know, in public positions, every decision you make sends a message. And during a time of crisis, the message you send matters tremendously to the people you serve. A third point, I think, is how do you manage, or how does a leader manage the information flow? I think there's a tendency in most leaders that I've seen, that I've studied, to put together what we now call sort of a command and control approach. Gather around you all those you need, centralize the information process so you have a handle on everything, and then act accordingly. And I guess in many cases that works, but where we tend to see leaders falter, it seems to me, is how they manage the external communications flow. How do you know what the American people need to know now versus tomorrow versus months from now? Knowledge shapes attitude and opinion, and that determines whether or not history judges the way you managed a crisis successfully. There's a saying I think is probably overstated, that crises tend to define leadership. I would argue that's true, but if you look at the history of this country, in many ways, leadership helped to define the nature of crisis and whether or not we were successful in overcoming it. The last point I would make, and this is the political scientist in me, I guess, I'd fall back on Alexander Hamilton writing about the executive in the Federalist Papers, where he talks about the need for energy or strength in the executive. And his argument is energy is essential to good administration, and he gives a long discussion of what good administration is all about. His point is an energetic executive, a competent executive, should be able to manage the nation in a time of crisis, because an energetic executive has the tools to do the job, has the character to do the job, is able to maintain a good read of human nature, which in the end is the essential task of leadership, and a combination of confidence and humility. And that package, I think, is the kind of package that is able to sustain the challenges of crisis. Thanks.
Thank you, Gene. Dick Thornburgh.
My observations will be a little less analytical and a little more anecdotal. I'm going to focus on what might fairly be called a case study of the accident at 3 Mile Island. I won't rehearse all of the history and details and facts of that incident. Today's Wall Street Journal summarized it very succinctly. It said 25 years ago this week, something went horribly wrong at 3 Mile Island. Human error and mechanical failure conspired to send the temperature in the TMI reactor core soaring, threatening a blast of deadly radiation. That was a somewhat rude introduction to the governor's office in my first term, and I want to concentrate on one particular aspect of the challenge of dealing with that crisis that I think overrides all, and that is how difficult and how essential it is in a time of crisis to have a firm grip on the facts. This was an event that had never happened on the face of the earth. There was no precedent, no guidebook to pull down from the shelf. And we needed facts in two respects. One, as a basis for decision making, and secondly, to communicate adequately and accurately to the public, which was as confused as many of us in government were as to what the ramifications of this accident were. We recognize that credibility in public office is a very fragile commodity, and that in order for us to communicate to the public, we had to be as sure as we could be of the accuracy of the information we got. Our sources were meager. The operator of the plant proved to be hopeless within the first 6 hours, either telling us more than they knew or less than they knew. And looking to the experts and their divergent views, we were forced to constantly cross-examine them and to triangulate their recommendations to come up with something that was reasonably approximate to the truth. Our salvation came only with the arrival of a true hero of the 3 Mile Island accident 2 days after it occurred, when Harold Denton, a middle-level bureaucrat from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, was dispatched by President Carter at my request to provide us with a credible source of information. He evidenced very quickly an ability to combine his knowledge of nuclear energy and the jargon attached to it, and the ability to speak plain English, and came very quickly to be a credible source that enabled us not only to use as a basis for decision making, but to reassure a obviously nervous public about what precisely was going on. And having that kind of a source at the site in an incident like this was invaluable. Let me mention one other thing before I complete my quick tour around 3 Mile Island, and that is the advances in technology that have taken place since 1979 are truly breathtaking. In only 25 years, we've seen whole new systems of communication, which, if they were in place during that time period, would have made our task a lot easier. There was no such thing as a cell phone in 1979. There was no such thing as the internet and the ability to send email. And a lot of the breakdowns in communication would have been solved provided those fragile technologies, even today, held up during that period of time. The other phenomenon was the advent of 24-hour cable television. At that time, we all relied on the evening network news, on colleagues of Roger Mudd's for our news on a daily basis. Nowadays, that news happens in real time. And a lot of the time for reflection that was necessary for newsmen and decision makers alike to come up with the best approximation of the truth that they could has now been dispelled by the race to get to the air. I hasten to add that I have no solution by way of inhibitions on the cable network news, but only take notice of the fact that that instantaneous news causes real problems for decision makers trying to puzzle through an intricate and difficult challenge. That's my 2 cents worth for the evening. I look forward to your questions and to conversation with my colleagues. Thank you.
Dick, just to pick up on the 3 Mile Island scenario, if I remember, on whatever day it was, the 29th of March, this was the second day after the explosion, you had a press conference and you said, if I recall, that there was no cause for alarm. But the next day, you ordered the evacuation of pregnant women and preschool children within a 5-mile zone of what happened between the 29th and the 30th.
Far be it from me to challenge the memory of an anchor man. But I remember very well what happened and what I said, and it was a very curious kind of thing. We had very carefully parsed out our reports to the people of Central Pennsylvania. On Thursday afternoon, we held a press conference where we stated we were still trying to separate fact from fiction and still trying to get a fix on the matter, but that there was no immediate threat of radiation release sufficient for us to take any action. As soon as I finished that statement, one of the people from the Department of Energy piped up and said, "The danger is over, the problem is solved." And it sent a shudder through my spine because I knew that wasn't the case. The next morning we had a bogus evacuation scare transmitted to us from Bethesda, where the National Nuclear Regulatory Commission headquarters was, based on faulty data. And we had to go on the radio at the time and assure people that there was no general evacuation being undertaken. In conversations with the NRC, we decided that as a precautionary matter, we would order on Friday afternoon, recommend, not order, but recommend the evacuation of pregnant women and preschool children, both of whom were disproportionately susceptible to radiation effects, to evacuate and to close all the schools. But the point is that this was a constant seesaw up and down based on the acquisition of new facts, based on the discarding of old facts. And what we tried to do time and again, if we had made a bad call, to go immediately to the public and tell them that the situation had changed and that we had a different scenario in mind, something very difficult to do for people in public life who never like to admit that they're anything but perfect in their observations. So your observation and your recollection is not at all erroneous, Roger. I just wanted to add a few nuances to it.
But I mean, what did that do to your credibility as governor?
Kept it up, I think,
I mean,
because we were willing to go back and say we were wrong.
So
If we had toughed it out and said what we said the first time was correct and devil take the hindmost, then I think our credibility would have been shot.
Gene?
Oh, just to pick up on that last point you made, Governor, about the 24-hour news, talking heads and many cable outlets. That, by definition, represents a challenge to leadership in any event. But can you imagine that context against the challenges you had at the time? Because your ability not only to correct the record, but to also deal with people who are correcting your record constantly and looking for ways to report a story, not necessarily to undercut you, but to find the conflict. It seems to me that while there are many benefits to the technology, that the overall challenge is managing the media in a way that may be almost impossible in the modern age.
I think that's correct, and I remind you of my earlier observation that we had, the landscape was jammed with so-called experts who had their own views and their own opinions about what should have been done. Most of them were wacky. They really didn't know what they were talking about. But they wanted to get some notoriety, or they had a particular cause they were pushing. And if those folks had instantaneous access to the news media, it would have created a lot more confusion than there actually was at the site.
And now they do. They're all wacky and they have instantaneous access to the news media.
They're not all wacky, but some of them are.
They're not all wacky, is that what you said? Jim Blight has a comment or question.
Both, actually, regarding Dick's struggle with the media, and also, I gather, a struggle to actually figure out what was going on to the best of your knowledge at that particular moment. President Kennedy and his advisors debated in secret for more than 6 days about what to do regarding the discovery of the missiles in Cuba in October '62. We now know from the documents that after the first meeting on the first morning, everybody, including the president, had agreed there was no way out other than to bomb the sites. But they were going to take a lunch break and then come back. And over a period of days, not hours and certainly not minutes, they convinced themselves that they needed to think more about what the Russians might do in response and how little they could predict that. How could they know this? And so it's always been a conundrum for people who are trying to figure out whether they did the right thing or not. Yes, they kept us out of war, but on the other hand, it's a democracy, and the voters, the American public, was kept in absolute darkness for 6 days while people debated questions of nuclear holocaust. So the question is, for you as a person who had to deal with this in real time and in a mess, is how to balance what you owe to your constituents in terms of information because of the kind of society we live in, versus your own tendency, I gather, to not take precipitous action based on a kind of straw vote at any given time.
Well, I think I want to reiterate a point that Eugene Hickok made about this impulse to do something. I was faced with that during this particular crisis. I'll never forget my director of emergency management coming into my office and saying, "My troops are leaning forward in the trenches." And I thought that was about the worst possible news I could have, because clearly they had a plan, they had all kinds of schemes as to how to evacuate people, and we knew that evacuation at best is a risky matter involving potential for injury and perhaps death. And that kind of impulse simply had to be resisted. I want to make one correction, and I may have left the impression that I was deriding the news media's conduct during the 3 Mile Island accident. Actually, they were pretty good. And because neither they nor we had a full grasp of what was going on or of the technology, we did a lot of swapping of information and sharing of viewpoints with them. There was only one exception where the reporting was outrageous, and that was a British news source that said the governor's wife, pregnant with their first child, had left the area. As it turned out, my wife wasn't pregnant. We had 4 sons, and she stayed in the area. But that was the exception. Most of the reporting was pretty good. The real problem in a case like this, where there's so much uncertainty and confusion, it seemed to me, was for us to go public when we had a reasonable assurance that we had something to say, always keeping in the back of our mind that we might have to go public again in a relatively short period of time and say what we told you before isn't accurate. We've learned new facts. Here's what the situation is. That happened on the very first day when we were given what I think could fairly be called a snow job by the utility running the facility, and we later discovered that it was a snow job, and without using that terminology, went to the public and said it isn't really quite the way that they explained it. And that was a constant effort that we made throughout the period.
Let me ask if any of the 3 of you think that the Kennedy administration could have kept deliberations about the Cuban Missile Crisis secret for 6 days, given the present scrutiny of the media, the lack of the morning cycle and the evening cycle, a cycle every 30 seconds, constant observation, Palm Pilots back and forth. Could they have kept it secret, and could you have resisted, Governor Thornburgh, the pressure of today's media, waiting 24 hours before you went before the public? I mean, how given today's media, given the constant pressure for action, for some sort of executive power being shown, how do you resist?
I think it's not a function of the media so much as it is a function of the character and quality of the people that you have advising you. If they're bound to run a race to see who can get to a friendly reporter as quickly as possible, then you're shot. You're not going to keep anything secret. If, on the other hand, given the enormity of the Cuban Missile Crisis, they're going to recognize that any kind of leak out of those deliberations could have fatal consequences for the American public, if not for the nation as a whole. If they recognize that, you're going to be in pretty good shape. And I'm not sure that anything would be different today. News media may be omnipresent, but they aren't wise. And they need sources, as you know, Roger. And if they don't get sources, they don't get news.
Jim?
Yeah. Partway through this first 6 of the famous 13 days, James Scotty Reston of the New York Times called Kennedy and told him essentially what the situation was, and did he understand it the same way. They had the story. Yes, there were missiles in Cuba. They were clustered at 4 sites on the northern perimeter of the island. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of Cuban exiles patrolling through South Florida. There were just slightly fewer reporters patrolling that same area. But the way that it was resolved is in part a response to Roger's question, which is the way it was resolved is Kennedy asked them to hold the story. And they did. Now that's something that I can't quite imagine. A, that there'd be one person to call who could hold the story and make sure that all the other troops were in line. And second, that that person would actually do it in mortal fear that the next 100 people in line would have gotten it.
Well said. I agree with you, and I think that the race to be first today among a widely proliferating news corps is a very dangerous proposition for decision makers in that kind of setting.
So you all have spoken about one of the important attributes of a leader is to manage, the necessity for a leader is to manage the media. I mean, when I hear that as a journalist, all I hear is spin. Now tell me the difference between that and spinning, managing the media and spinning. I mean, is that really leveling with the public and telling them what they really need to know to make an intelligent decision? Gene?
Well, for me, I use the term manage the information flow, both internally as you have people around you trying to make decisions and help you make decisions, and also how you help the American people understand the nature of the crisis you confront. Spin, to me, is marketing information. And I would make a distinction between managing information and marketing it. And I think managing information in this age, to your question, really becomes one of the central challenges, not just of leadership in crisis, but of government in a republic. I mean, one of the challenges we have is the ability to distance ourselves at times of crisis, of important decision making, and have the time to make tough decisions without the sense that every word we say will be spun by somebody or marketed by somebody and come back and make it impossible to accomplish what we have to accomplish. So to me, that's the distinction I would make. And I do think, as was demonstrated during the Cuban Missile Crisis, sometimes it is important to withhold information for the moment so that the public interest can be served, as long as, in the end, the information is available. In the long run, is the long-term interest of the society you're trying to serve. And sometimes that is not served well by making sure that everybody knows everything immediately all the time.
So what you mean making sure that in the end it's available? How long will it take to get to the end?
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the challenge. I mean, the media will certainly be on top of it, and you want to make sure that as the information gets out, it's accurate. I mean, one of the challenges we've seen in the past is individuals who withheld information after the events take place, and then history writes the truth. And sometimes that truth is pretty ugly, sometimes that truth is not. I do think in the public service, individuals have an obligation to make sure an accurate representation of the decision-making process is provided as soon as possible.
Yeah, I don't think it would be sound governing or responsible reporting for either of our administration or the news media to have gone public with every cockamamie rumor that reached our ears during the first hours of the 3 Mile Island accident when nobody really knew what was going on. So if it's managing the news to try to double check these stories and to cross-examine people as to their veracity, so be it. I think that's the only responsible thing you can do in order to present a fair, accurate picture to the public.
When Jim left off, he raised some questions about how Kennedy and his advisors had handled the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Johnson and his. So what was the difference, Jim? Was it Lyndon Johnson's vanity that prevented him from accepting the advice of his advisors? The way you described it, John Kennedy seemed to lack a high sense of, he was willing to accept, he was willing to be told he was wrong. So what's the difference?
Well, that's the question, of course, and we're all going to have to vote on that, some version of that question come November. One of the things that pops up over and over again is not just that Kennedy asked more questions than Johnson. It's not really true. He didn't ask more questions than Johnson. But there is definitely a sense in immersing yourself in these tapes that he was actually looking for an answer that he hadn't already arrived at. And that's less true of some of the Lyndon Johnson, I would call them pseudo-consultations with people in his war cabinet. But the main thing, I think, is that if you take it a step further, Kennedy is really asking, what is it like to be in the skin of the enemy? What really is going on over there? He needed to know that, to know how would they persevere. If we send 10,000 troops or 10 million troops, we're going to come home, and they're not. So tell me a little bit about these people. Who are these guys? As you may remember, some of you, I look out there, I think you would remember the summer of 1963 when the Buddhist monks in Saigon began burning themselves to death at an awful rate. And Kennedy famously said, in fact it's the title of a book now, who the hell are these guys? What is that about? You didn't tell me. You told me there were communists and anti-communists. Now there's these people, these Buddhists, and they're setting themselves on fire, and all hell is breaking loose. We call that empathy, or we call that the empathic or empathetic urge. I'm sorry, my background happens to be in psychology, so you'll have to forgive me for that one. Johnson, less so. I don't think it's vanity so much. I think it's a lack of inquisitiveness about what it's really like. He claimed, he said often that he would seduce Ho Chi Minh. He said that he would, he would grab him by the leg and he'd work up to the thigh and so forth and so on, and all that's kind of famous Johnson talk. But there is a sense in which all the things that he'd already learned were just good enough to solve this problem. It's just a question of what his price is, or where the cutoff point is. And I think Kennedy really wanted to know, who are those guys? What are they thinking? And if I were in their shoes, what would they think of me? That's a little different, I think, than just vanity and no vanity.
You remember the famous quote when Johnson was walking out of the White House, and there were 2 helicopters there, and the sergeant said, Mr. President, is this your helicopter? And he said, son, they're all my helicopters. But did the Kennedy administration have a better understanding of the Soviet Union than the Johnson administration had of Vietnam and the culture in both countries? Did that figure into their response?
Yeah, it sure did. We had in those days what was known as the Russian service. There were people who had done nothing but study Russian history and the Soviet Union for 40, 50 years. George Kennan was one of those. Chip Bolin was another. And Llewellyn Thompson was the third. And Llewellyn Thompson was the guy sitting next to Kennedy when Kennedy was trying to figure out what would be the reaction of Khrushchev if I did A, B, or C. With Vietnam, we did a little research on this, and I won't claim this is definitive, but I don't believe any senior member of either the Kennedy or Johnson administration ever spoke to a person who spoke Vietnamese other than an interpreter. There was no advisor on Vietnam who knew much about Vietnam, who they could trust, who actually sat in on the meetings. There's plenty of knowledge in the system, but the president's a busy guy, and so are his cabinet secretaries. So the knowledge of Russia, if you want to take the comparison, ask how much they knew about Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The only person in the room who actually knew anything about it was Ed Martin, and Ed Martin's job was to chair the committee that directed the Operation Mongoose operations, which were meant to destabilize Cuba, assassinate Castro, and replace his government with one that was in a hotel room in Miami. That's not what you call empathy. for the adversary. And as it turned out, if hostilities had broken out and a war had broken out in Cuba, the Kennedy administration would have been in very tough shape because they didn't have anybody to turn to for that knowledge. Even though Kennedy probably would have turned everywhere he could, it just wasn't there the way it was with the Soviet Union.
Jim, can I ask a question? Just help me out here a little bit. Implicit in your earlier remarks, I gather, is your sense that President Kennedy would have, within a very short period of time, withdrawn our troops from Vietnam. My understanding is that that is a conclusion that is even today somewhat a matter of controversy, and you know this area, and maybe you can help us out.
Yeah, ever since Kennedy was assassinated, the question of what
we know what Oliver Stone thought.
Right. Exactly. Well, he thought, yeah. Yeah, we do. Good movie, bad message. The question has always been put, what would Kennedy have done? And I think the answer to that is, I don't know, and probably he didn't know exactly. I mean, things change. He was pragmatic, so who knows? What has not been fully appreciated, I think, up to this point, because of the nature of it's like Camelot, anti-Camelot. If you believe that Kennedy would have pulled the troops out and not sent the army in, then you're considered to be, among some people, a person buying into the Camelot fantasy, whereas if you believe the reverse, you're sort of blind to the facts. Well, this doesn't get anywhere. But what we now know is that in May of 1963, at the Defense Secretary's annual conference in Honolulu, Kennedy had already made a decision to pull out. It's in black and white. Not only did he make the decision, but the whole military bureaucracy was heading in that direction. We have all the plans. And the reason these plans have only now become available is that it was in the process, it had to do with the Kennedy assassination papers, that some papers from the Joint Chiefs got thrown in. And this led to the declassification of some of the tapes. The question is, did Kennedy make this decision on the basis of thinking that we would win, and therefore we could pull them out? And the answer to that is somewhat controversial. I mean, there's room for doubt. My own personal view is that we didn't need to win. In fact, it was his conclusion that there was no way to win this war in any traditional sense. So what would he have done? Dan Ellsberg has some interesting things to say about it in his memoir, Secrets, last year. You keep it quiet. You withdraw them gradually. You deny if you have to. You do whatever is necessary, but you get those people out of there. And then if the people you've trained can't win their own war, then it's not your problem.
Do you remember
mislead the media?
What? You remember George Aiken, the senator from Vermont, said what you do is you put out a press release from the White House that says, we won and we're coming home.
Coming home. Yeah. That's not far, actually, that's a kind of Kennedy-esque strategy that never was implemented.
Gene, since you're in the Department of Education and have a grip on the government's lack of empathy for the cultures of other countries, can we apply the lack of empathy that Jim mentioned to the current Iraq war and our apparent lack of empathy with the Muslim world and our understanding of it?
Thank you for putting me on the spot, Roger. Appreciate that. Well, frankly, I think this nation, not just its elected officials, but I think the American people have a lack of empathy, certainly lack of understanding of much of that world. I think the immediate reaction after 9/11, after the shock, was, how could these people hate us? What makes us so bad? I even remember the president talking about that, and then talking about what can we do to better understand them as well. But I don't think it was just a case of elected officials. I think it was a case of the American people not having any empathy for that part of the world, except for those who study it, perhaps. And we have a real, going back to your point, we have a real lack of expertise, working expertise of that part of the world. And I think that's being reflected somewhat in the challenges we confront right now over there.
Is that a failure of leadership?
I think it is a failure to recognize that little lessons we might have learned along the way we didn't learn. And that's in part what this whole commission's discussing right now about what could we have done. I think it's been oversimplified in terms of why didn't we do something. I think that's unrealistic. But what can we learn about little indications and big indications over time? There should have been a light bulb going off for all of us.
I can see the headline now. Hickok says Bush light bulb failed to go off.
Thanks again, Roger.
That ignores the fact that lack of knowledge of the Muslim world is not a fresh phenomenon.
No,
It's one that's
right.
been continued throughout administrations from time immemorial. And there are a lot of other areas of the world and a lot of other things in the world that we don't understand or begin to grasp because most of our thinking is strategic. The reason we had those Russian experts was because we faced a real threat following the end of World War II and a great deal of concern prior to World War II about the then Soviet Union. I doubt if there were that cadre of Russian experts in the State Department in the 1880s when we were really kind of unconcerned about what went on in Tsarist Russia. So we're always bound to be a little bit behind the curve in our capabilities in understanding and being able to respond to these threats as they arise.
But that gets to the larger point, and that is the world has changed so dramatically, and the urgency with which events can transpire requires us to be a lot better at getting to know the world we live in. I mean, Governor Ridge, my former boss, made the observation, it's not unique, I don't think, that we live in a world in which now it is possible for one person with enough will and enough resources to bring down a country. And that's a world we've never lived in before. And we're still having a hard time realizing that. And so our ability to think several steps ahead and to factor in information that's always been there, but as you suggest, because there is no immediate need for it, we have to rethink that. And that kind of crisis, I think, is one that we still, as an American people, are having a hard time putting into context.
Jim, you're going to make a comment, and then we're going to open it up, because I promised after 35, 40 minutes we would. Jim?
Yeah. In the 60s, I don't think anybody, at least I don't remember, worrying about whether or not the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong, or the North Vietnamese government was going to invade San Diego or was going to start shooting down commercial aircraft, none of that sort of thing. Nor, in spite of all the rhetoric coming out of Cuba, which, by the way, 1/3 of all the paper generated in the Kennedy administration was about Cuba, if you can believe, if you want to understand what a true obsession that was all about. Were we particularly concerned that Cubans were going to do this, that, or the other thing to us? We don't have that luxury anymore. It doesn't even have to be a rebel movement. As Jane said, it could be an individual, could be a small cluster of individuals who've bought something here, stolen something here, and put it together and can create havoc for all of us. So that the world is, it's almost as if it's spinning exponentially faster than it used to. You do have, if the Vietnam War were occurring right now, you would have to worry that the NLF would find some way to shoot down airplanes, to blow up power plants, to do all that kind of thing. I don't think, in fact, we asked them once in a conference whether they'd ever thought of this, and they said, no. It just seemed too impossible.
Okay. Tell me what the system is. You've got handheld mics. There are mics in the two rows here in the center, and I gather the portable mics will move around so you don't have to leave your seats. So can we start off with a question from way in the back? There's a hand about some lady in the balcony. Doctor. and he's going to read it. Uh-oh.
You asked to vote for president in November, and why are you voting for him?
What? We didn't hear the question.
Who do you plan to vote for president in November, and why?
They haven't even been nominated yet.
Well, that about wraps it up. Yes, sir.
My question is for Dr. Blight. You mentioned about James Reston, and you speculated. I can give you a two-word answer: Matt Drudge.
He said a two-word answer to the position James Reston occupied, now position of Matt Drudge.
Yes.
Yes.
What I learned a couple things tonight, and one was about empathy. And I believe it occurred in the mid-90s that career people could enter the diplomatic service, U.S. diplomatic service, without knowing a foreign language. And Dr. Blight, you were mentioning about George Keeney. I believe he could read Russian upside down. And so when he was interviewing in Moscow, he was reading their secrets laying on their desk without them knowing it. I don't believe that we have that capability available, and that's that human intelligence that's lacking today.
We should also point out that over the last, I've forgotten, some of you here may know the details, but for a very long time, the budget of the State Department has been declining. I mean, it fails to attract the kind of people that George Kennan became because it just doesn't have the resources, and I think probably the lack of resources is a function of the end of the Cold War, the end of the strategic threat, and the lack of a 9/11 kind of an event, and the implicit feeling that what could hurt us anyway. And so we're going to cut the budget, we'll cut the State Department. There have been some dramatic cuts along those lines.
I have one brief question for Dr. Blight again. You were talking about the I better regroup my thoughts. I'll come back to you. Thank you.
We all have those moments, sir. Some have more than others. There's a question back here.
Yes.
Yes.
As someone who was in New York City on 9/11 and who had to experience not only CNN's coverage, but New York One's coverage, which was quite dramatic, I wondered if you could reflect on how you think that affected the American psyche in a good way or in a negative way, and as well if you could reflect on your opinion of our country's color code alert system and whether or not it's effective. Is it good to know we're at code yellow or that we're at code orange or code red, and how is that really helping our anti-terrorism efforts? Thank you.
We'd like to be up. That's for Gene.
By the way, you know who I'm going to vote for. I happen to be in New York the same day, as a matter of fact. There are a couple of things. I'm not sure, I'd love to get some other reaction to this. I'm not sure beyond the first several days and weeks and beyond those who were closest either physically or emotionally to the actual events that the American people really have adjusted to a world that is unlike any we've ever lived in before. We live in a time unlike any in our nation's history. And part of that's good that we haven't done that, because we have the unique character of doing what Americans do in spite of all this. But I do think that we need to adjust our perspective and our context to the urgency with which events can transpire. On the code, I think it is as much a product of our ability to understand its nuances as it's a rather blunt instrument, but it's the best we can come up with right now. I can't stress this enough. It goes back to your point about having experts who understand language and understand cultures. I'm not sure that will be adequate to the task the way it once was with a George Kennan, because you're not dealing with nations necessarily, or governments necessarily, or movements. You're dealing with action, random, immediate, senseless, very difficult to predict. And so the code system right now seems to be our best attempt at trying to adjust to a world we still are trying to begin to understand.
May I add something to that?
Go ahead.
You talked about adjustment, Gene, and I think that one of the things we don't fully comprehend is the enormous adjustment that has to be made by our law enforcement and intelligence communities. I've served for the last 2 years or so as a consultant to the FBI and observed very close up the shift that's taken place in their modus operandi and their priorities. Heretofore, the FBI's primary focus was on gathering legally admissible evidence of a violation of the federal criminal law after the fact so that it could be presented in court to secure a conviction before a judge and a jury of those people responsible. Now, their prime priority is to gather information, whether legally admissible evidence or not, before the fact, to thwart what otherwise might be a horrendous terrorist episode within our country. That's an enormous change in viewpoint, and it has ramifications throughout the entire intelligence community and law enforcement community to which we haven't fully adjusted, and has caused a great deal of friction and misunderstanding insofar as our own basic rights and liberties are concerned. This is something we're going to have to puzzle through over an extended period of time if we truly want to provide protection to our nation, its infrastructure, and our loved ones.
Do you think, Dick, that that new role for the FBI is justified by the circumstances?
I do.
You do?
I think we're living in a different era. For us to treat terrorism as a law enforcement problem would be a tragic mistake. It is a war we are engaged in. It's a period of time during which we have to exert ourselves to prevent people from undertaking these kinds of attacks. And the major focus of the 9/11 Commission right now is on why this wasn't done prior to 9/11 in an effective way, and that's caused a reaction within the law enforcement and intelligence communities to do what they believe the American people want to have, and that is protection from these attacks rather than a successful prosecution after a successful attack.
Gene?
Just to put a coda on that, one of the great debates taking place right now in terms of foreign policy, defense policy, international affairs is the idea of preemption. And that's what you just said we're talking about now. The idea of preemption, whether or not we should be willing through the military, through the armed forces, through the FBI, to take actions in anticipation of bad things happening to make sure they don't happen. That is a brand new conversation for this country. It'll be a centerpiece of the presidential debates, I'm sure. But that's how much the ground has shifted. And that's how much the culture needs to begin to think differently about the world we live in. I don't have the answer, but I do think we need to start thinking about how you stop bad things from happening before they happen, because they're pretty bad.
There's a question back there. Is there one? Yes.
There was an article in the Sunday New York Times about leaders admitting wrongdoing or fault. And you've talked a lot about not having all the answers and intense media coverage. What do you think admitting wrongdoing or fault has to do with leadership in times of crisis?
I think it has to do with credibility. I think if you are stubbornly insisting on a version of the facts that you have put out and those facts erode, then your credibility is threatened. And it behooves, I think, effective leaders to constantly review and re-plow the factual basis upon which decisions have been made, and if they find that basis is incorrect, to rectify it.
Jim?
One of the most probably amazing press conferences ever held by a president was held by Kennedy on April 20th, 1961, when he asked the American public to blame him for the Bay of Pigs disaster. Several of his senior advisors had said they were willing to resign and say that they didn't feed him the right intelligence, they didn't give him enough. And he told them all to tear up their resignations, that he was going to go out there and take responsibility because it was his responsibility. And it had pretty much the same effect that Dick is talking about. He, for the first time, this young sort of, New York GQ model-looking guy suddenly seemed a little bit better and certainly a lot more credible than he had before.
Would you hold just 1 minute? Back to the admitting mistakes, the question. Since both of you are aligned with the Republican past and present, the current administration is under a lot of pressure, Rumsfeld, Cheney, the president, to admit a mistake on Iraq. Is that a justified question, and do you think they ought to be admitting a mistake?
Not any pressure from me. I don't think they did make a mistake.
No. They're constantly asked by the maligned media to admit a mistake. But so my question is that a legitimate question?
Sure.
Well, I think it's a legitimate
question. Sure. Always. I think you've got to get used to the fact when you stick your head up over the trenches as an elected public official, you're going to be questioned on everything you do. The question that we're asked about here is a palpable misstatement or a palpable error, as in the Bay of Pigs, which I think everyone now agrees was that. I think Jim's exactly right that President Kennedy enhanced his own credibility enormously by that simple act. And it was followed up by no recrimination, and in fact, a lot of plaudits. That's a good model to follow, I think, when an egregious mistake.
You think admitting a mistake, admitting an honest mistake, in fact, damages a leader's qualities? No.
I don't think so.
I don't think so, but we're talking in code here because there's so much nuance involved. I mean, as you yourself pointed out, the president's being questioned daily by the news media and by his partisan opponents on what his attitude is toward the Iraq war based on this development or that development. I don't make that the equivalent of a misguided policy, a clearly misguided policy that underlay the Bay of Pigs, or a failed execution.
Yes, sir, right there. You had a question.
Well, my understanding after the...
Can you come? There you are.
Thank you. My understanding after the Bay of Pigs, after President Kennedy gave his press conference and took responsibility, he then fired the CIA director. Wasn't that correct?
Yeah, he fired the only director they'd ever had, Alan Dulles, and he went deeper. He fired the deputy director for operations, Richard Bissell. So both their careers were over.
So based on that premise, if President Bush said, I made a mistake in Iraq, I'm going to fire Don Rumsfeld and companies of Rice, his statute would be enhanced.
Well, the analogy might be George Tenet here, in terms of intelligence, getting the wrong intelligence taking an action.
Could I just follow briefly? There's a term that I think you used early in your comments that doesn't get used a whole lot when we talk about presidential elections, but I think it was central, at least a long time ago, to the architecture behind the office. And that is the idea of character in its broadest sense. And a lot of what we're talking about in terms of how one approaches tough decisions, difficult choices, whether or not to talk about a mistake you made, all that is sort of a product of one's character, which is a very complex thing. Our national debates are primarily partisan debates over policy and records and stuff like that. But in essence, part of our challenge is to get a sense of the person, because that's what comes out in the middle of these crises. And it's a very hard thing to measure. But that office, by definition, if we're talking about the presidency, the character of that office is molded by the person in it, as you just pointed out with two presidents. And so one of our challenges with all the smoke of a presidential selection process is how do you get at how one approaches those fundamental decisions? And that's character.
Yes, sir.
To change the subject a little bit for Governor Thornburgh, the one tidbit that I became aware of tonight was your engineering background, and my question is, at the time of 3 Mile Island, of course, the president was an alumnus of the nuclear Navy, and with your engineering background, I would wonder if you could talk a little bit about the interaction there of the two leaders and how it might have been different if we had two laymen or more non-technical type people in those two roles.
That's a very painful subject. I hold an engineering degree, to be sure, but I do not have the temerity to describe myself as an engineer because I never really practiced as an engineer. Nonetheless, your point has some validity to it because you develop, as an engineer, a firm respect for the facts. People who design buildings and bridges and other structures have to be sure of their facts before they translate them into things upon which human life and safety depend. I must say that having abandoned my fruitless pursuit of an engineering career, I became a lawyer. And as a trial lawyer, you develop certain skills at cross-examination. And they were, in fact, probably more useful to me during this interlude than any residual engineering know-how that I had. And I mean that literally. We almost conducted what amounted to a grand jury investigation by trying to get some of these folks to tell us what they knew and not what they suspected or speculated or whatever. And it was a very painstaking process. But because of the centrality of hard facts in making a decision as to whether to ask 200,000 people to evacuate during a period of high stress, we had to keep constantly going back and hammering at that. And that's one of the major lessons I learned from this particular crisis.
Since this young man has been standing, I'm going to call on him, and then we'll go to the two on the aisle who have the luxury of sitting. Go ahead, sir.
This question is for Dr. Blight. Can you comment on the role of Adlai Stevenson in the Cuban Missile Crisis? Because as far as I'm aware of, there were two known occasions to me in which he displayed amounts of courage that Kennedy himself had not only admired early on in his life, but also written about in his book. And the first example that comes to mind is in the meeting when he played devil's advocate and basically suggested a diplomatic solution to what every other person in the room was suggesting military action for, and also the dramatic events that unfolded on the floor of the UN. Can you discuss those, please?
Yeah, Adlai Stevenson, ambassador to the UN, a perpetual presidential candidate through the 50s. This is we all have our painful subjects, and every so often when I'm feeling particularly good about the Kennedy administration, somebody says, what about Adlai Stevenson? Stevenson came down from New York partway through the discussions in the secret phase and said, you guys are just debating whether to attack or whether to blockade the island. Have you ever thought about just trying to bargain these things out, just to go off somewhere and reason it out? Maybe, there are ways to do this. Unfortunately, Stevenson arrived after the point where that was a viable option. So that's not so bad. Stevenson's performance on the floor of the UN is probably the best that's ever been given. I mean, I know that Colin Powell is said to have watched tapes of this before his year ago February. I don't think is destined to go down in history as maybe having given quite as good a performance as Stevenson did. Now, but what you didn't ask about, and what is really inexcusable, is that after the missile crisis, some people in the Kennedy administration, with, I think, authorization from the president, had decided that it wasn't good enough to actually come out victorious, but they fundamentally destroyed Adlai Stevenson's career by saying that Adlai wanted a Munich. They gave interviews to certain people claiming to leak things that essentially that Stevenson wanted to just give away the store. Stevenson was never the same man again. He really wasn't. I mean, he was publicly humiliated by the administration after performing, I think, extremely well in the line of duty in a thankless task in those days, which was to be the ambassador to the UN.
What would have been the Kennedy administration's motive in doing that? He certainly wasn't a threat to challenge John Kennedy in 1964, was he?
No, I don't think so. I'd rather not speculate too much about this. I do know that in 1960, the feelings that were aroused between the Kennedy camp, the Johnson camp, and the Stevenson camp got incredibly personal, and I can only assume that some of these were left over.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Mr. Mudd, for Dr. Blight, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that 6-day period, we heard reports about naval vessels passing closer and closer and surveillance. But was it our strong posture, or was it in fact we gave up those missile sites in Turkey, which at that point was really critical in our defense? So historically, I come away, we were the ones that lost ground.
The argument here is that actually the U.S. did, in a way, cave in by agreeing to, quote-unquote, trade NATO missiles in Turkey for missiles in Cuba. I don't think so. I mean, it was part of the deal. It was a secret part of the deal. It was only repeated.
What? That was critical. That gave us a blind spot.
Give him the mic, please.
Yeah.
That was a blind spot we had, and it took us time to cover that blind spot. And think back in the 60s.
I'm trying. With a colleague and I interviewed Dean Rusk in Athens, Georgia in May of 1987. And the Turkish foreign minister, the man who had been the Turkish foreign minister at the time of the missile crisis, had just died. And Rusk said, "You're in luck. So-and-so just died, and now I can tell you what happened." He said, "You know, the Turks play tough. If we had talked a lot about a trade and so forth, and that the Turks had not been brought into this, we'd have had a Turkish missile crisis, because they were just as stubborn as the Cubans. I mean, in a way, they were." He said, "The funny thing about it was the missiles in Turkey were totally useless. They were completely obsolete, and the nuclear subs were ready to come online, but the Turkish military didn't like subs because you couldn't point at them. You couldn't say, 'That's us. We're part of NATO. We're part of Europe.' They had a damn sub is out in the ocean somewhere underneath. Much better coverage, much less vulnerable, but it made the Turkish generals a lot less happy." Anyway, they were taken down the following April and destroyed.
Yes, sir.
There have been some very interesting comments about the pressures on leaders in terms of the media pressure, the questions, the constant cycle and all that, and also advisors funneling information in. And my interest is trying to focus on the moment at which a critical decision is made in a crisis. Do leaders, or should leaders, still withdraw themselves from everything, have a moment to themselves, to collect themselves, to perhaps realize that they're, part of a greater force in the universe or something, and then make a decision? Is there time for that kind of moment, the traditional dramatic moment that we all think of in decision making? Is there still time for that in the real world today? And should there be if there isn't?
It's an interesting question. Anybody going to try that?
Yeah, I think it's a much broader question than simply crisis response. The time for reflection in public life has been greatly diminished by this constant attention to the political process and to the news media because of the technological innovations. My favorite story about that is an observation I read once about George Washington going to the Constitutional Convention from Mount Vernon. He rode by horseback from Mount Vernon to Philadelphia. It took about 5 days. And you know what he was doing all that time for 5 days? thinking. Thinking, no doubt, about what the shape of this nation was to be out of a session that was going to rethink the Articles of Confederation and ultimately produced the finely tuned instrument we know as the Constitution today. Public officials don't get that kind of time today. They're lucky to have 5 seconds to think about long-term implications of their time in office and decisions they have to make. So I think your point's well taken, but I'm hard-pressed to come up with any kind of remedy. I guess we just have to be a little bit quicker on our feet and a little bit sharper in our thinking.
Gene?
Well, I do think the governor's absolutely correct. The ability to reflect, to internalize and deliberate. But I do think, even with the most recent events of 9/11, that sense of history, both what you learn from history, which informs how you proceed to make decisions, and the sense of the moment, that how you make this decision or these decisions will create the next history. I think there are moments when outstanding leaders are able to do that, even if it's very quick, and they have to, because they know it's larger than themselves. And that's what leadership's all about, I think. It's not you and this decision. It's a much larger context, and your ability to sort of do that is critical. It may be very, very difficult, but I think that might be one of the true measures of leadership.
Do you think our leaders really want to be left alone?
Left alone?
Yeah.
I think...
I mean, they are very, very dependent on staff and advisors. I mean...
I think they're very dependent. I think they have been for a long time, only now do we realize just how dependent. But I do think, in the end, great leaders recognize they're the ones who have to make the call. And that adds a dimension that I think takes the full measure of a person, frankly.
Well, I've got 5 minutes of 9, and I think there's one more question there, and then unless there are others, that'll be our last one if that's meets the Dean's approval. Yes, sir, in the back.
This just be a kind of follow-on to the last question. Wouldn't a really good leader know what a crisis is, instead of letting the media define a crisis and sell it every 3 or 4 days? A good leader can kind of sort out the chaff and cut to the chase. I don't know quite how to say it, but I don't know if anyone would have a comment on that. Instead of letting the media, define what the crisis is and crop one up every time, is there a point where a leader would come in and say, listen, you guys, let's don't worry about this. Let's get on to other things. And is that, would that be seen as stonewalling all the time?
Well, that kind of goes to a comment I made earlier on, and that is, in many ways, leadership defines a crisis. We tend to think leaders are defined by the moment. In many ways, leadership is all about knowing whether or not there is a crisis and how best to define it and move on. So I think you're right. I think you're right.
If you let the media define what's a crisis, you are toast.
Well, on that warm note, you've taken me into your hearts. But I tell you, for all the hits the media has taken, and indirectly me, it's been a great pleasure to be here. You're a great audience, and I think I can speak for the panel, Thornburgh, Hickok, and Blight, that we've enjoyed being here as much as I hope you've enjoyed being with us. So thank you very much.